Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was to create a video where we now focus on what is the foundation of our class, which is rhetoric and argument. So for the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about rhetoric and argument. And the story you're going to read this week is a story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Amelia's. And I'll suggest that really this story comes down to rhetoric and argument. But before we can start talking about argument, the first thing we have to do is we have to define rhetoric, because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we have our discussion about and start getting into arguments, we need to talk about rhetoric. So what I would normally do in a ground class is I would write down the term rhetoric on the board, and I'd ask students, I'd ask them first to define rhetoric. And even in that case, that would be a little bit of a challenge for students, because some students would admit that they don't know how to define rhetoric. Some students would say that they'd never heard the term rhetoric, right? And some students were uncertain about their definition of rhetoric. So I think before we can talk about rhetoric, right, we need to kind of address that there may be some students in our class, right, who I've never heard the term rhetoric. So usually what I start off our class talking about forms of rhetoric, right? So I talk about, and before I can get there, I want to talk about if we can say that there are people who use rhetoric. And just about every student in any class can raise their hand and say that they know that there are people who use rhetoric. We don't know the definition of the word, but we know that there are people who use rhetoric. So the first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, who are the people that use rhetoric? And in any class that I can use, whether it's a ground class, an online class, most students associate rhetoric with politicians. They all can say that they've heard that politicians have used rhetoric. And think about it, we're entering an election year, and somewhere along the lines in the last couple of weeks, you might have heard something like Donald Trump is using rhetoric. Don't know what that means, went out one year, out the other, but I heard that Donald Trump is using rhetoric. You might have said that Joe Biden is using rhetoric, or Kamala Harris is using rhetoric. We have no idea what that means, but we know that those are the people that are associated with rhetoric. The second group that is always associated with rhetoric, and students always associate with rhetoric, is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And that would make sense, because if you think about what does a lawyer do? A lawyer is going to argue. They're going to argue for their client, right? So those are the two that students can always associate, that people who use rhetoric. And then if we break it down, they might say things like teachers use rhetoric, right? Or they might say philosophers use rhetoric. People like Socrates, Aristotle are always associated with rhetoric. And I always like to point out that students use rhetoric, they just use it very poorly. So if you think about all I've done here, we've just sort of established, we said, here are the people who use rhetoric. So now I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. What might be a form of rhetoric? So if I were to say, invite a guest speaker on this video, and I say, hey, look, I have a guest speaker who's going to come on this video in just a second, right? And that guest speaker would be former President Barack Obama. And so you'd say Barack Obama came on here, and I might ask you, okay, so we know that Obama is using rhetoric. What is he doing? And most students would say, well, he's giving a speech. He's talking. So notice a speech might be a form of rhetoric. And then I ask students, well, how many people have seen Barack Obama speak live in person? And most people, some people may have, Obama may be a dated reference. He hasn't been in office for so long. But that some students have said, I have some students who have served in the military that might have said they've seen Obama speak, and I'll say, well, how is it that, and then I might ask how many people have seen him live in person, and not very many people would raise their hands, and I'd say, how is that possible? People would say TV. So notice TV might be a form of rhetoric. So we could say speech is a form of rhetoric, TV is a form of rhetoric, and that leads us to other things that might be a form of rhetoric. Movies, video, radio could be a form of rhetoric, right? These are all just forms of rhetoric. Sometimes we might say books are a form of rhetoric. Or if a book is a form of rhetoric, who would be the person that used it? Would be a writer. Well, if a writer is a form of rhetoric, that could mean a newspaper is a form of rhetoric, right? So notice all I've done here is just kind of tried to establish, we know there are people who use rhetoric, politicians, lawyers, teachers, philosophers, students. We know that there are forms of rhetoric, which could be a speech, which could be a book, a newspaper, right? TV. The internet is the greatest form of rhetoric of all time. Emails are a form of rhetoric. So I am going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric for the start of class will be words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And what I want you to do in this discussion board is I just kind of want to know, what is your reaction? There's another video that might help you understand rhetoric and argument, but I want to know, what do you think of my definition of rhetoric? What did you learn about rhetoric from this video? And then we'll kind of play around in the next couple weeks and talk about rhetoric in more detail.